June 3, 2024, the day Venezuela crossed the Rubicon. Let me tell you about the moment that should have set off alarm bells in every foreign policy think tank from Washington to Beijing, but instead slipped under the radar like a shadow in the night. On that Monday morning, Venezuelan naval vessels intercepted and boarded two Guyanese-flag oil exploration ships operating in waters claimed by both nations. The official story? A routine enforcement action, a minor flare-up in a long-running territorial dispute. But here's the thing, when I saw the satellite imagery, the troop movements, and the timing of it all, I knew this wasn't just another skirmish in South America's perennial border squabbles. This was a calculated move, one that Venezuela couldn't and wouldn't have made alone. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of American hegemony. And what I saw in those first 48 hours after the incident told me everything I needed to. Venezuela didn't act alone. Not by a long shot. The question isn't whether Caracas had outside help, it's who provided it, why, and what it means for the next phase of global conflict. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about what the official narrative wants you to believe. Because if you've only been following this story through Western media, you've been fed a very specific and very incomplete version of events. The official a simple border dispute gone wrong. According to the State Department, the UN, and most major news outlets, this is what Venezuela, facing economic collapse and desperate to distract its population from domestic misery, decided to escalate its century-old claim over the Essequibo region, a 61,000 square mile territory rich in oil, gold, and rare earth minerals currently administered by Guyana. The pretext? A December 2023 referendum in which Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to annex Essequibo, followed by President Nicolas Maduro's announcement that Venezuela would begin issuing oil exploration licenses in the disputed waters. When the Guyanese flagships Petrobras 1 and ExxonMobil 3 entered the area in early June, Venezuelan forces moved in, detained the crews, and seized the vessels. The U.S. condemned the action as a flagrant violation of international law. The UK, Guyana's former colonial power, sent a warship to the region as its show of support. The OAS called for restraint, and within 72 hours, the story was already fading from headlines, dismissed as just another case of a failing state lashing out. But here's the problem with this: it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. First, let's talk about capability. Venezuela's navy is a shadow of what it once was. Decades of corruption, sanctions, and brain drain have left it with a handful of aging patrol boats, most of which can't operate beyond coastal waters. The idea that it could project force into disputed offshore zones against ships backed by ExxonMobil's security apparatus without logistical support is laughable. Yet somehow, Venezuela managed to coordinate a multi-vessel interception in international waters, with real-time satellite tracking and electronic warfare support. That doesn't happen by accident. Second, timing. This escalation didn't come out of nowhere. It followed a series of high-level meetings between Venezuelan officials and their counterparts in Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing in the weeks prior. Publicly, these were billed as economic cooperation talks. But when I cross-referenced flight logs and open-source intelligence, I noticed something: a Russian Il-76 transport plane, known to ferry military advisors and equipment, made an unscheduled stop in Caracas on May 28. 3 days later, a Chinese-flagged cargo ship, the Yuan Wang 5, a vessel with known signals intelligence capabilities, docked in La Guaira. Neither event was reported in the Venezuelan press. Third, the response. When the US and UK sent naval assets to the region, they didn't just show up, they rushed. The HMS Dauntless was diverted from NATO exercises in the North Atlantic. The USS Miami, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, surfaced near Trinidad and Tobago in what the Pentagon called a routine port visit. Routine? In the middle of a crisis? I've seen enough of these deployments to know that submarines don't surface for PR stunts. They surface when they're positioning for something. So what's really going on here? Let me connect the dots. Deconstructing the hidden: who really benefits? The first rule of geopolitics is cui bono, who benefits? And in this case, the answer isn't just Venezuela. Let's start with the most obvious: Russia. Moscow has been steadily increasing its presence in Latin America for over a decade, but the past 2 years have seen an acceleration. Why? Because the US has been bleeding resources into Ukraine, and the Kremlin is exploiting the distraction. Venezuela is Russia's most reliable ally in the Western Hemisphere, a client state that provides a foothold in America's backyard. But more importantly, Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. If Russia can help Caracas secure control over Essequibo's offshore fields, it gains leverage over global energy markets at a time when its own exports are under sanctions. Now, here's where it gets interesting. In March 2024, Russia's state-owned Rosneft signed a deal with Venezuela's PDVSA to jointly develop offshore blocks in the disputed zone. The contract was vague, but the subtext was if Venezuela gains control of Essequibo, Rosneft gets first dibs on its oil. And if you think this is just about profit, think again. Russia doesn't need Venezuelan oil, it needs to control the flow of oil to the west. Every barrel that doesn't reach Europe or the US is a strategic win for Moscow. But Russia isn't acting alone. China has its own interests here. Beijing has been quietly extending its influence in Guyana, investing billions in infrastructure and rare earth mining. The Essequibo region is believed to hold significant deposits of lithium and cobalt, critical minerals for China's tech and defense industries. If Venezuela takes control, China loses access. So why would Beijing support Caracas? Because this isn't just about Guyana. It's about the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. For the past century, the US has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. China's strategy isn't to challenge that directly, it's to create alternative spheres of influence. By backing Venezuela's territorial claims, China forces the US to divert attention and resources to its own hemisphere, weakening Washington's ability to counter Beijing in the Indo-Pacific. It's classic great power bleed your adversary where they're strongest. And then there's Iran. The Islamic Republic has been supplying Venezuela with drones, missiles, and technical expertise for years. But in the weeks leading up to the June incident, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors were spotted in Venezuelan military bases. Their mission? Upgrading Venezuela's coastal radar systems and anti-ship missile capabilities. Why? Because if the US or UK were to intervene militarily, Iran wants to ensure that Venezuela can make it costly. So let's Venezuela, a country with a collapsing economy and a barely functional military, suddenly gains the ability to project force into disputed waters. Russia gets a stranglehold on regional oil. China ties down US resources. Iran gains a proxy to harass the West. And the US? It gets another crisis to manage in a world where it's already stretched thin. This wasn't an accident. It was a coordinated escalation. The exited geopolitical a new Cold War in the tropics. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana. This is about the death of American unipolarity and the rise of a multipolar world order. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it could maintain global dominance through military primacy, economic coercion, and the export of liberal democracy. That era is over. What we're seeing now is the fragmentation of the international system into competing blocs, each with its own rules, currencies, and spheres of influence. Russia, China, and Iran aren't just allies, they're forming a counter-hegemonic coalition. And Latin America is the perfect place to challenge US power because it's where America is most vulnerable. The Monroe Doctrine isn't just a policy, it's a psychological barrier. For 2 centuries, the US has treated the Western Hemisphere as its private domain. When another great power encroaches, whether it's the Soviet Union in Cuba or China in AMA, Washington reacts with visceral alarm. This is why the Venezuela-Guyana crisis is so dangerous. It's not just a border dispute. It's a test of American resolve. And the US is failing. Let me give you a historical parallel. In 1962, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The US responded with a naval blockade and threatened military action. The world came to the brink of nuclear war, but in the end, the Soviets backed down. Why? Because the US had overwhelming military superiority and the will to use it. Today, the situation is reversed. The US is the one with overextended forces, a divided public, and a leadership that's reluctant to use military power. Russia and China know this. They're probing, testing, seeing how far they can push before Washington pushes back. And so far, the answer pretty far. But here's the thing about great power: it doesn't stay contained. Every time the US allows a challenge to go unanswered, it emboldens the next one. If Venezuela can seize Essequibo with impunity, what's to stop Nicaragua from invading Costa Rica? Or Bolivia from making a play for Chile's lithium fields? The US can't defend every inch of its sphere of influence, not when it's also trying to contain China in the South China Sea and Russia in Eastern Europe. This is the dilemma of imperial overstretch. And it's why I've been warning for years that the US is sleepwalking into a multipolar trap. Military and strategic, the illusion of easy victory. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because if you've been listening to some of the hawks in Washington, you'd think this was a slam dunk, a quick surgical strike, a few days of airstrikes, and Venezuela would back down. But anyone who thinks that hasn't studied the last 20 years of American military interventions. First, let's look at the balance of forces. Venezuela's military is a paper tiger in some respects, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and demoralized. But it's not defenseless. With Russian and Iranian help, it now has anti-access/area denial capabilities that would make any US intervention costly. We're talking advanced air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and electronic warfare tools designed to blind American satellites and drones. Then there's the terrain. The Essequibo region is a jungle-covered nightmare. Any ground invasion would require moving troops through dense, roadless terrain where Venezuela could wage a guerrilla war for years. And let's not Venezuela shares a 1,400-mile border with Colombia, a US ally. If the US invades, does it also secure that border? Or does it risk opening a second front? And what about Guyana itself? The country has no standing army to speak of. If Venezuela invades, the US would have to commit ground forces to defend it, a commitment that would look an awful lot like occupation. Remember Afghanistan? Iraq? Libya? The US has a long history of winning wars and losing the peace. And in a region where anti-American sentiment runs deep, even a successful intervention could backfire spectacularly. But the biggest risk isn't military, it's escalation. If the US strikes Venezuelan forces, Russia and Iran have already signaled they'll respond. How? By supplying Venezuela with more advanced weapons. By targeting US assets in the region. By escalating in other theaters, Ukraine, the Middle East, the South China Sea. This is the interconnected nature of modern conflict. A crisis in one part of the world doesn't stay there. It metastasizes. And let's not forget the nuclear dimension. Russia has already hinted that it would consider deploying tactical nuclear weapons to Venezuela if the US intervenes. Now, I'm not saying Moscow would actually use them, but the mere threat changes the calculus. The US has spent decades trying to prevent nuclear proliferation in Latin America. If Russia breaks that taboo, it sets a precedent that could haunt Washington for generations. So when I hear politicians in Washington talking about a limited strike or a quick operation, I want to grab them by the lapels, and there is no such thing as a limited war in the 21st century. Every conflict the US has entered in the past 20 years started with the promise of a swift victory. Every single one ended in quagmire. The domestic political why this crisis is perfect for Washington. Now, let's talk about the one group that does benefit from this: the US political establishment. Because here's the dirty little secret of American foreign crises are good for business. They rally the public around the flag. They distract from domestic failures. And most importantly, they justify bigger defense budgets. Let's look at the timing. The Venezuela-Guyana escalation comes at a moment when the Biden administration is facing historically low approval ratings. Inflation is still high. The border crisis is out of control. And the 2024 election is shaping up to be a rematch between two of the most unpopular candidates in modern history. What better way to change the narrative than a good old-fashioned foreign policy crisis? Now, I'm not saying the White House planned this. But I am saying that when a crisis like this lands in their lap, they're not exactly rushing to de-escalate. In fact, they're doing the opposite. Consider the players involved. Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, is a known interventionist. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, is a former Raytheon board member, someone who stands to benefit from increased defense spending. And then there's Antony Blinken, who has spent his entire career pushing for a more aggressive U.S. posture abroad. But the real tell is the media coverage. When was the last time you saw a major U.S. news outlet question the narrative that Venezuela is the sole aggressor? When was the last time you heard a serious discussion about diplomatic solutions? Instead, what we get is a steady drumbeat of Maduro is a dictator and the U.S. must stand with Guyana. Now, don't get me wrong, Maduro is a dictator. But that's not the point is that foreign policy is being used as a domestic political tool. And that's dangerous, because when you start making decisions based on what plays well in swing states rather than what's best for national security, you end up with disaster. Just look at the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. Buried in the bill is a provision that authorizes the Pentagon to conduct military exercises in Guyana, code for positioning U.S. forces in the region. The bill also includes $500 million in security assistance for Guyana, most of which will go to U.S. defense contractors. Coincidence? I don't think so. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US and its allies managed to de-escalate the crisis through diplomacy. The UK and Brazil broker a deal where Venezuela withdraws its forces in exchange for Guyana agreeing to joint development of the disputed oil fields. Russia and China, seeing that the US is willing to negotiate, back off. The crisis fades from the headlines. The problem? This scenario requires all sides to act rationally. And in a multipolar world, rationality is in short supply. Venezuela has already burned its bridges with the West. Russia and China have no incentive to back down. And the U.S. political establishment has no appetite for a deal that could be spun as appeasement. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. This is the slow burn crisis. Venezuela doesn't invade Guyana outright, but it continues to harass ships in the disputed waters. The US and UK send more naval assets to the region, but stop short of direct confrontation. Russia and Iran keep supplying Venezuela with weapons. China increases its investments in Guyana, hedging its bets. Over time, the situation becomes normalized. The Essequibo dispute becomes another frozen conflict, like Cyprus or Kashmir. The US gets bogged down in a low-level proxy war, draining resources and attention from more critical theaters. And the world moves one step closer to a new Cold War. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Iranian support, launches a limited invasion of Essequibo. The US responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Russia deploys advisors to Venezuela. Iran activates its proxy networks in Latin America, targeting U.S. assets. China, seeing an opportunity, increases military support for Venezuela while also escalating in the South China Sea. Before long, the U.S. finds itself in a multi-front conflict, one it can't win without risking nuclear war. The global economy collapses. And the post-World War II international order shatters. Now, I'm not saying this is likely. But it's possible. And in geopolitics, possible is often enough. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is the US in this mess in the first place? The answer lies in 30 years of failed grand strategy. Since the end of the Cold War, the US has pursued a policy of liberal hegemony, the idea that it could reshape the world in its own image through military force, economic coercion, and the export of democracy. This strategy has failed spectacularly. Here's the uncomfortable: liberal hegemony didn't just fail, it actively created the conditions for its own collapse. And Venezuela's gambit in Essequibo is just the latest symptom of a much deeper disease. Let me explain why this matters. The US spent the last 3 decades exiting NATO, bombing Serbia, invading Iraq, overthrowing Gaddafi, and trying to turn Syria into a democracy at gunpoint. Each intervention was sold as a moral imperative, a necessary step to spread freedom and stability. But what did it actually achieve? A world where Russia feels encircled, where China sees containment as an existential threat, and where smaller nations, like Venezuela, have learned that the only way to resist American pressure is to align with its rivals. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about ideology. It's about raw power. The US military budget is larger than the next 10 countries combined, yet it's stretched thinner than ever. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy identified China as the pacing threat and Russia as an acute threat, but it also admitted that the US is no longer capable of fighting 2 major wars simultaneously. That's not a sign of strength, it's a confession of strategic overreach. And here's where the military implications of the Essequibo crisis become impossible to ignore. The US has been pivoting to Asia for over a decade, but every time it tries to focus on the Pacific, some crisis in the Middle East or Europe or now Latin America pulls it back. The 2003 Iraq War cost $2 trillion and 4,500 American lives, but its real price was the distraction it created. While the US was bogged down in Baghdad, China was building artificial islands in the South China Sea. While the US was bombing Libya in 2011, Russia was annexing Crimea. And while the US was obsessing over Ukraine, Venezuela was quietly turning into a Russian-Iranian forward operating base in America's backyard. This isn't a coincidence. It's the predictable result of a strategy that treats military power as a Swiss Army knife, capable of solving every problem, from terrorism to democracy promotion to great power competition. But military power isn't infinite. Every drone strike in Somalia, every carrier group in the Taiwan Strait, every special forces operation in Niger comes at a cost. And right now, the bill is coming due. Take the US Navy, for example. The fleet is shrinking while its missions are exting. The 2023 China Military Power Report from the Pentagon estimates that the People's Liberation Army Navy has surpassed the US Navy in total battle force ships, with 370 to America's 291. Meanwhile, the US is trying to maintain a global presence, patrolling the South China Sea, escorting ships in the Red Sea, deterring Iran in the Persian Gulf, and now shadowing Venezuelan vessels off Guyana. That's not a sustainable posture. It's a recipe for exhaustion. And that's before we even get to the nuclear dimension. Russia has already threatened to deploy tactical nukes in Venezuela if the US escalates. Iran, for its part, has been quietly exiting its ballistic missile program, with help from North Korea. China, meanwhile, is in the middle of the fastest nuclear buildup in history, aiming to triple its arsenal by 2035. The US still has the world's most powerful nuclear force, but for how long? The last time America modernized its arsenal was during the Obama administration, and even that was a compromise. The reality is that the US is now facing 3 nuclear-armed adversaries who are coordinating their strategies in ways we haven't seen since the Sino-Soviet split. So what does this mean for the Essequibo dispute? It means that the US is in a bind. If it backs down, it signals weakness to China, Russia, and Iran. If it escalates, it risks a multi-front conflict that could spiral out of control. And if it tries to split the difference, like it's doing now, with naval patrols but no direct strikes, it ends up in the slow burn scenario I described, a low-level proxy war that drains resources and attention from more critical theaters. Now, let's talk about the one thing no one in Washington wants: to the US is no longer the sole superpower. It's still the strongest, but it's not omnipotent. And the more it tries to act like it is, the more it accelerates its own decline. The 2008 financial crisis was the first major crack in the post-Cold War order. The 2016 election of Donald Trump was the second. The chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 was the third. And now, the Essequibo crisis is the fourth, a reminder that the world is no longer willing to accept American hegemony as a given. Here's how the US could have avoided this. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a brief moment when America could have reshaped the international system in a way that didn't rely on endless military interventions. Instead of exiting NATO to Russia's borders, it could have worked with Moscow to create a new European security architecture. Instead of treating China as a rising threat, it could have integrated Beijing into the global economy while setting clear red lines on military action. Instead of overthrowing governments in the Middle East, it could have focused on stabilizing the region through diplomacy and economic investment. But that's not what happened. Because liberal hegemony wasn't just a strategy, it was an ideology. And ideologies don't adapt. They double down. So here we are, in a world where the US is simultaneously overstretched and underprepared, where its adversaries are more aligned than ever, and where every regional crisis has the potential to become a global one. The question now is whether the US can break out of this cycle. Can it accept that it no longer has the power to dictate outcomes everywhere? Can it prioritize its core interests, like preventing a Chinese takeover of Taiwan or a Russian victory in Ukraine, over peripheral conflicts like Essequibo? And can it do all this while maintaining its alliances and deterring its adversaries? I'm not optimistic. The US political system is designed to reward short-term thinking and ideological purity, not strategic discipline. The foreign policy establishment is still dominated by the same people who got us into Iraq and Libya, and they're still selling the same more sanctions, more military deployments, more regime change fantasies. Meanwhile, the American public is exhausted by endless wars, and the rest of the world is tired of being told what to do. So where does that leave us? With a choice. The US can either accept that its unipolar moment is over and adapt to a multipolar world, or it can keep pretending that it's still 1991 and watch as its power erodes one crisis at a time. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about a strip of jungle and some oil reserves. It's about whether the US can still shape the world or whether the world is finally shaping itself. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's gambit in Essequibo wasn't just a foreign policy move, it was a domestic survival strategy. And that's where the real story begins, because Maduro's regime is far more fragile than most Western analysts care to admit. The numbers tell the tale. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013, a collapse worse than the Great Depression in the US or the fall of the Soviet Union. Hyperinflation peaked at 1.7 million% in 2018, and even after dollarization stabilized the worst of it, the country remains a shell of its former self. Oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today, less than half of what it was under Chavez, and a fraction of what it could be with proper investment. But here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just clinging to power because he's a dictator who loves the trappings of office. He's clinging to power because the alternative is prison or worse. The International Criminal Court has an active investigation into crimes against humanity in Venezuela, and the US has indicted Maduro himself on drug trafficking charges. The opposition, for all its flaws, still commands significant support, and the memory of the 2019 coup attempt, when Juan Guaidó was recognized as interim president by over 50 countries, still haunts the regime. So when Maduro looks at Essequibo, he doesn't just see a territorial dispute. He sees a lifeline. Let me explain why this matters. In authoritarian regimes, nationalism is the last refuge of the politically desperate. It's no coincidence that Maduro's referendum on Essequibo came just weeks after the US eased some sanctions in exchange for electoral concessions. The Biden administration, in a rare moment of pragmatism, had allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in Venezuela, and there were even whispers of a broader deal, sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections. But Maduro, ever the survivor, knew that such a deal would be his political death sentence. The opposition would have won in a landslide, and the Chavista elite would have been left exposed, their corruption and mismanagement laid bare for all to see. So he did what dictators do when they feel the noose: he manufactured a crisis. The Essequibo dispute wasn't just about oil or territory, it was about rallying the base. The referendum was a sham, of course. The government claimed 95% support, but independent observers noted suspiciously low turnout in opposition strongholds. Still, it served its purpose. Maduro could now portray himself as the defender of Venezuela's sovereignty, the man standing up to foreign imperialism. Never mind that Guyana, a country of 800,000 people, poses no real threat to Venezuela's 28 million. Never mind that the US and Brazil have both made it clear they won't tolerate an invasion. The point wasn't to win a war, it was to avoid losing power. Here's where the domestic and geopolitical dimensions collide. Maduro's move in Essequibo wasn't just a Hail Mary pass to distract from economic collapse. It was also a signal to his patrons in Moscow and Beijing that he's still a player worth backing. Russia, after all, has been Venezuela's financial lifeline, restructuring billions in debt and providing military support. China, meanwhile, has invested heavily in Venezuela's oil sector, even as production has collapsed. Both countries see Venezuela as a critical node in their broader strategy to erode U.S. influence in Latin America. And both have a vested interest in keeping Maduro in power, not because they love him, but because the alternative is chaos, and chaos is bad for business. But here's the: neither Russia nor China is willing to go to war for Venezuela. Putin has his hands full in Ukraine, and Xi Jinping is more interested in economic coercion than military adventurism. So while they'll provide rhetorical support and maybe some arms sales, they're not about to risk a direct confrontation with the US over a strip of jungle in South America. That leaves Maduro in a precarious position. He's betting that the US is too distracted by Ukraine and Taiwan to care about Essequibo. And for now, he might be right. The Biden administration has been cautious, emphasizing diplomacy over confrontation. But if Maduro miscalculates, if he invades Guyana or even just escalates tensions further, he could find himself facing a U.S. response that goes beyond sanctions. So what happens next? Let's game out the scenarios. The most likely outcome is that this remains a low-intensity conflict. Maduro will keep ratcheting up the rhetoric, maybe even stage a few military exercises near the border. Guyana, for its part, will continue to rely on its Western allies for support, particularly the US and the UK, which has historical ties to the country. The US Southern Command has already increased its presence in the region, and there's talk of joint military exercises with Guyana. But neither side has an interest in all-out war. Guyana's military is tiny, and Venezuela's is a hollowed-out shell, more concerned with internal repression than external conquest. The second scenario is more a miscalculation. Maybe Maduro, emboldened by his referendum victory, decides to seize a small piece of territory, say, the town of Ancocco Island, which Venezuela already controls but Guyana claims. Or maybe he orders a naval blockade of Guyana's offshore oil fields. Either move would force the U.S. to respond, and the Biden administration, already under pressure from Republicans to take a harder line on Venezuela, might feel compelled to act. We could see targeted sanctions, a naval deployment, or even covert support for Guyana's military. The risk, of course, is that such a response could spiral into something larger. Venezuela's military, for all its weaknesses, is still capable of asymmetric warfare, and Maduro has shown a willingness to use irregular forces, like colectivos, to harass opponents. The third scenario is the most: regime collapse. This is the one no one wants to talk about, but it's a real possibility. Venezuela's economy is still in shambles, and the recent easing of sanctions hasn't been enough to jumpstart growth. The opposition, despite its divisions, still has a chance to win in the 2024 elections if they're free and fair. But if Maduro rigs the vote, as he's done before, we could see mass protests, a crackdown, and even a military split. The last time Venezuela's military faced a serious crisis, during the 2019 coup attempt, it held together. But loyalty isn't infinite. If the generals start to believe that Maduro is more of a liability than an asset, they might turn on him. And if that happens, all bets are off. We could see a civil war, a refugee crisis, or even a foreign intervention, though the latter is unlikely, given the US's reluctance to get involved in another Latin American quagmire. Now, let's talk about what this means for the US. The Essequibo dispute is a test case for American power in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the U.S. treated Latin America as its backyard, intervening at will to install or remove governments. But those days are over. The region is more independent than ever, and countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia are charting their own courses. The U.S. can still exert influence, but it has to be smart about it. Sanctions have failed to topple Maduro, and military threats would only play into his hands. The better approach is to work with regional partners, particularly Brazil, which has taken a leading role in mediating the crisis, to contain Venezuela's ambitions while offering a diplomatic off-ramp. But here's the U.S. foreign policy establishment is still stuck in the past. The same people who pushed for regime change in Iraq and Libya are now calling for tougher action on Venezuela. They see Maduro as a thug who must be removed, not a leader who can be managed. And while I share their distaste for his regime, I also recognize that the alternative to Maduro isn't necessarily democracy, it's chaos. The US needs to accept that it can't control every outcome in Latin America, and that sometimes the best policy is to contain the damage rather than try to fix it. So where does that leave us? With a region that's increasingly asserting its independence, a US that's struggling to adapt, and a crisis that could either fizzle out or explode. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about a border conflict, it's about the future of American power in the hemisphere. And if the US can't handle this, how can it handle the bigger challenges ahead?